Good day, everyone. My name is Rebecca Lilly for the International Association for Energy Economics. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar entitled Consumption and Non-Payment Responses to Retail Electricity Prices in India. We are grateful to our speaker, Shefali Khanna, for today's timely discussion. First, a little bit about the International Association for Energy Economics. We are the largest association specializing in the field of energy economics and provide a forum for the exchange of ideas, experience, and issues among professionals interested in the field. The organization produces 2 professional journals, a newsletter, and holds conferences and virtual presentations along with a host of other products and services that you can find at our website at www.iaee.org. If you're not already a member of the association, we welcome you to join. A few housekeeping matters in regard to today's webinar before I hand things over to our speaker. First, this webinar is being recorded for those that cannot participate in today's live event. If you have questions for our speaker, please click the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window and type your question. We've allocated time at the end of this webinar to read and answer them. And now I would like to introduce you to our speaker. Shefali Khanna is a research associate in energy and environmental economics in the Department of Economics and Public Policy at Imperial College London. Shefali, over to you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Thank you for arranging this webinar. So my name is Shefali Khanna, and I'm a research associate at Imperial College London. I'll be presenting some work today that's joint with a former classmate in my PhD program at Harvard Kennedy School, Kevin Rowe, who's now a data scientist at Uber. And in this paper, we estimate consumption and non-payment responses to retail electricity prices in India. So in many parts of the developing world, we see evidence of a subsidy quality trap in public service delivery, where public utilities providing services like electricity, water, transportation, sanitation find themselves in an equilibrium characterized by large subsidies to retail consumers, poor financial performance, and poor service quality. We think that this equilibrium is perpetuated by a self-reinforcing cycle where regulated prices for public services are generally set far below cost, creating cost under recovery problems for utilities, often necessitating some form of cross-subsidization by other parts of the market. Starved for resources, utilities turn to quantity or quality rationing, which worsens service quality and therefore undermines the value of the service to the public, as well as the rationale for raising prices and or providing tax support. Now, India's electricity distribution sector is a leading example of this type of phenomenon and has been for several decades. Electricity prices for residential and agricultural customers typically cover 50% or less of the cost of supply, and we think the effective prices these customers pay are perhaps even lower given high rates of non-payment. As a consequence, utilities hold massive amounts of debt. The amount of debt held by distribution companies alone in India at the end of 2019 was roughly the equivalent of about 2% of GDP. And extrapolating from some recent survey evidence, probably hundreds of millions of people, particularly in northern India, face power outages longer than 10 hours per day. And while the overwhelming majority of the country has been connected to the electric grid, electricity reliability continues to remain at the forefront of energy access policy. Now, when you look at the literature in economics, many see these retail price subsidies as being the root cause of dysfunction in electricity distribution in settings like India. And much of this research suggests getting the prices right as being the first step to solving the problem, which means raising prices so that utilities can cover their costs and finding other means of redistribution, perhaps through taxes or transfers. Now, in order to provide empirical evidence, in order to sort of inform the costs and benefits of retail pricing reform, we try to provide empirical evidence on 2 key behavioral parameters that are needed to think about policy solutions to this problem. First, we estimate price elasticities of demand in order to be able to measure how much surplus subsidies deliver to customers and how that varies across customer types. And second, we examine how bill payments directly respond to price increases. And that's really an important question, because if you raise prices and payments go down, then it's not clear that you've solved the utilities' financial problem and if thus helped them get out of this trap. So what are the main contributions of this research? First, by and large, estimates of retail price elasticities for electricity are generally only available in developed countries. And to the extent that people are more price sensitive at lower levels of income, these elasticities may not necessarily apply when we're thinking about designing retail rates in a developing country. And indeed, our estimates of residential demand elasticities in India are about 3 to 5 times larger than the best estimates from the US. Secondly, we find very few well-identified estimates of long-run demand elasticities in the literature. And these are particularly important, not only for generators and distributors to make optimal investments in generation capacity infrastructure, but also for predicting the long-run response to market-based environmental policies, carbon pricing, to the extent that a carbon price is passed through into retail electricity rates. And so we find significant heterogeneity in our estimates of long-run demand elasticities, with the estimates being largest for commercial industrial customers and smallest for the poorest residential customers. And finally, in this paper, we provide novel evidence of how non-payment directly responds to retail price increases. And these non-payment responses appear to be entirely concentrated among the poorest residential customers, for whom we find that arrears more than double in response to a doubling of the average electricity price in the long run. Okay, so for this project, we have 5 years of billing data for the universe of residential, commercial, and industrial customers served by an electric utility in Delhi, India's capital. The empirical approaches that we use to estimate short and long-run responses to prices are different, but they both rely on features of the incredibly complex retail tariff schedule, which generates large short-run and small but persistent long-run variation in prices. So for our short-run estimates, we exploit 3 subsidy policies that were introduced in Delhi starting in 2014, which created large notches in the price schedule for residential consumers. And so we use these subsidy notches in a regression discontinuity framework to compare the consumption and non-payment responses of customers that end up falling just on either side of the notches in the months following the introduction of the subsidy. And for our long-run estimates, we exploit billing adjustments that the utilities use to roughly equalize the price schedule on a per-day basis for customers that have billing cycles of different lengths. And this creates small but persistent annual variation in the average price of electricity. We also have in the paper a stylized model to guide intuition as to how regulators should design retail prices in the presence of non-payment. Okay, so as I mentioned, the setting for this study is Delhi, where reforms in the late 1990s partially privatized the distribution network, introduced incentives for utilities to make investments to improve reliability, and nearly tripled retail prices for residential customers over the course of a decade. So the figure here illustrates the average cost of supply, which are the dashed lines, the average revenue, which are the solid lines, for the utilities in Delhi, shown here in green, and the average utility in India, shown in purple. And so, as you can see, the average cost of supply for the utilities in Delhi increased steadily over this period. That was due to the investments that were made in network upgrades. As part of these investments, utilities invested in theft detection infrastructure. So electricity theft is no longer a major contributor to the commercial losses of the distribution companies in Delhi. But that's not true elsewhere in India. And so for the purpose of this paper, we kind of focus on this margin of non-payment of bills. And then, this sort of increase in average cost is accompanied by an increase in average revenue, which of course was supported by the retail price increases that occurred over this period. I think the most striking aspect of this figure is that while the utilities in Delhi have remained largely profitable over this 15-year period or so, the average utility in India continues to lose money on every unit of electricity that it supplies. And that really sort of dampens the incentive for utilities to expand access to energy in most parts of the country. Okay, so local elections in 2015 in Delhi swept in a populist government that sought to reverse the price increases of the previous decade. So this government campaigned on cutting electricity prices in half. It announced 20,000 liters of free water to all households in the city. The subsidies became even more generous over time. So prior to the local elections in 2019, the government offered free electricity up to 200 units for all households. And so for our short-run analysis, we really try to leverage these subsidy shocks to see how consumers kind of responded, both in terms of their consumption behavior as well as their bill payments. Okay, so for this project, we collected data from a private distribution utility in Delhi. The data set consists of 79 million individual power bills and all reported outages for the universe of residential, commercial, and industrial customers served by this company, which is a little over 1.5 million. And we have these data for 2015 to 2019. We use the sequence of bills for each customer to infer payments by comparing the current charges on the bill with the customer's account balance. And we'll use arrears as our measure of non-payment for most of the analysis. In addition, we conducted our own household survey of about 3,200 residential customers of this utility in the summer of 2019 in order to collect data on demographics, appliance and backup power investments and usage and perceptions of service quality. And we're able to link the survey responses with the billing histories of these customers in the administrative data. Okay, so the first thing we do is we look at how payment rates and bill consumption are correlated with household characteristics for the sample of customers whom we surveyed. So this table reports estimated coefficients and customer level clustered standard errors for a series of univariate regressions of payment rate and bill consumption on these characteristics. So installed wattage here is the total electrical load of all the devices that a household can have connected to their meter at any given time. And we see that this variable is positively correlated with both payment rates and bill consumption. We also find that the number of rooms in the household and whether or not the head of the household has completed secondary education are also positively correlated with payment rates and bill consumption. We find that payment rates and bill consumption increase monotonically with annual household income. So this is something that we collect on the survey. So median annual household income for the survey sample is somewhere between 75,000 and 150,000 rupees per year. That's much lower than the average annual household income for Delhi as a whole, which is about 360,000 rupees a year. And so we're dealing with a slightly poorer demographic here. Okay, so as I mentioned, the price schedule in the setting is extraordinarily complicated. It's determined through a combination of fixed charges, an increasing block tariff on the variable component, and then subsidies that the government introduces at various points, which create these notches in the price schedule. So fixed charges are levied in proportion to a customer sanctioned load, and load is simply the total allowable wattage of all the devices that a household can have connected to their meter at any given time. This figure illustrates the average electricity price for residential customers in Delhi in 2017, and we've plotted this separately for different load categories. Each point here represents the mean tariff for all bills falling in 20 kilowatt hour bins. And so what we see here is that, at lower levels of consumption, fixed charges drive up the average price. And so that will disproportionately impact poorer consumers because we see in our data that income and consumption are highly correlated. Next, we look at estimating an empirical marginal electricity price for residential customers. And we do this separately for each fiscal year in our data. So, each point here is estimated using a procedure called forward first differences in 10 kilowatt hour bins. And the most salient feature of this figure are the spikes at 400 kilowatt hours. So what's going on here? Starting in 2015, the local government introduced a 50% subsidy on total energy charges, which is applied on your bill if your monthly consumption is less than 400 units. What that means is when your consumption goes from 400 units a month to 401 units a month, the average bill increases by 42%, which is a huge price shock. And the government introduced similar subsidies at the 100 and 200 kilowatt hour thresholds at other points in time, which generated similar but smaller spikes. Now, what's causing the spikiness in this figure? So let's say we have a two-tier increasing block tariff with the second tier starting at 400 units. Well, the marginal price up to 400 units is going to be flat. At 400, the cost of consuming one additional unit of electricity will be the marginal price at the first tier times 400 times 0.5 for the subsidy, plus the marginal price at the second tier. That gets you up to one of these points. Once you're at 401 kilowatt hours, you've lost the subsidy, and so you're back to the marginal price at the second tier. The reason why these spikes are not precisely aligned around 400 is because in this figure, we're not adjusting for the fact that these customers could have billing cycles of different lengths. And I'll get to that point in a few slides. So we're using these subsidy notches to look at how consumers responded in terms of their consumption and payment behavior. And we do this separately for two types of residential consumers, domestic and informal settlements. Informal settlement customers are essentially residential customers whose connections to the grid prior to the reforms of the late 90s were unmetered. So you can think of them as newly metered residential customers. The utility still considers them to be a separate customer type, but they face the same price schedule as regular domestic customers. They are poorer on average, which explains why their consumption distribution is more skewed to the left compared to domestic customers. Payment rates are also lower in this group. It's about 69% per year compared to about 89% per year for domestic customers. In these figures, I've illustrated the locations of the three subsidy notch thresholds, 100, 200, and 400. As you can see, the 400 kilowatt hour thresholds appears sort of at the tail of the distribution. And we find that 83% of residential bills actually fall below the 400 kilowatt hour mark, which suggests that the vast majority of residential customers in Delhi, including some potentially wealthy customers, are benefiting from this enormous subsidy that kicks in if you consume less than 400 units a month. Okay, despite the clear incentives to bunch right below the subsidy notch thresholds, we in fact see no evidence of bunching in the data. So these are manipulation tests for domestic customers on the left and informal settlement customers on the right for the three subsidy notch thresholds. And we've ordered them just based on when these subsidies went into effect. Now, there are a few reasons why we don't see any evidence of bunching. First, in order for customers to know their current consumption on a typical billing cycle relative to where these thresholds are, they would need to do a few things. They would need to know the exact start date and time of their billing cycle, which is going to vary depending on when the meter reader comes to their house. And there could be variation even within customers, depending on weather, holidays, etc. Second, customers would need to record their consumption at that time because meters typically display cumulative consumption and may never be reset during a customer's history. And finally, the exact location of these thresholds may vary slightly depending on the precise dates of the customer's billing cycle. So if customers are on a 30-day billing cycle, they might have this 400 kilowatt hour notch appear at a slightly different place compared to customers who are, say, on a 28-day billing cycle. And so for all these reasons, it's virtually impossible for customers to be able to precisely manipulate the thresholds. And faced with that difficulty, we wondered whether customers are sort of shading down their consumption, in order to safely avoid facing the price shock before the subsidy goes into effect. And we essentially don't see much evidence of that, although the evidence is a bit suggestive because consumption is very seasonally noisy. But in general, we don't find any evidence of bunching below the notch points. Okay, so while the price schedule generates these sharp discontinuities at the notch points, we use a fuzzy regression discontinuity estimator simply to rescale our outcomes by the magnitude of the price increase. So figure A here illustrates our first stage. This is the 42% increase in the average price that occurs when you go over the 400 kilowatt hour notch. Figures B and C illustrate the effects on billed consumption and arrears in the leading month after the subsidy goes into effect. So these are fourth-order polynomials fit separately on either side of the cutoff. And what we see here is that in response to this huge price shock, we find a very modest reduction in consumption, but almost a 40% increase in arrears. We do this at the 200 and 100 kilowatt hour notches as well, and find similar but smaller effects. And so it appears that customers are using arrears to absorb a portion of the increased charges, while only modestly, reducing their consumption. And so non-payment here could potentially be dampening this consumption response. We then look at how these effects persist in leading months after the subsidy is introduced. So column 1 here is just the first stage effect. That's the 42% increase in the average price. Columns 2 to 4 show the effects on arrears in the 3 leading billing cycles after the subsidy is introduced. And similarly, columns 5 through 7 show the effects on billed consumption in the leading months following the subsidy going into effect. And so what we see is that while the effect on consumption is relatively small, it persists up to the 3rd leading month, while the effects on arrears are large at the beginning, but they're relatively short-lived. And so we wondered, looking at this, whether these customers holding arrears are going into some form of temporary disconnection, which brings me to sort of the rules for sort of penalties, I guess, for non-payment. So the first thing that happens when you fail to make your bill payment by your due date is that there's a late payment surcharge at the rate of 18% per year that gets applied to your bill, and that just accumulates the longer you hold arrears. There are also rules around disconnections that the regulator requires the utilities to enforce. Just anecdotally, we know that these rules were not very well enforced during this period. We also, we don't observe disconnections directly in our data, but we come up with some rules to infer disconnection cases. And we, run the same analysis, dropping those cases. That doesn't really seem to affect the results very much. So it's still a little bit of an open question, but it does seem that customers are sort of delaying, making their payments when faced with this price shock. The reason that it's hard for utilities to, enforce payments is because non-payment tends to be concentrated in these informal settlement communities, which are also, communities that have the backing of local politicians, making it harder for utilities to enforce payments in precisely those areas. Now, with the advent of smart meters, utilities can remotely disconnect customers that fail to pay their bills. And so that has anecdotally, again, improved collection efficiency. But smart meters are sort of yet to be, rolled out on a wider scale. Okay, so just to support the internal validity of our regression discontinuity design, we generate these RD plots separately for the pretreatment covariates and billing characteristics that we're controlling for in our regressions. These include billed consumption and arrears in the month before the subsidy goes into effect, whether the bill belongs to an informal settlement customer and the customer sanctioned load. And as you can see in these plots, we don't see any significant discontinuities at any of the 3 subsidy notch thresholds, and that sort of lends support to the identification assumptions for the RD. So just to summarize this section of the analysis, despite the clear incentives, we don't find any evidence of bunching. We see that the billed amount increases by about 42% when customers end up exceeding this 400 kilowatt hour per month threshold. For customers who end up going over the threshold, we see that non-payment immediately rises by about 40%, while the reduction in leading consumption is relatively modest. And so it appears that customers are using arrears to absorb some of these increased charges, which suggests that non-payment could play a role in dampening the magnitude of the demand response, which again, we're estimating with respect to the average price on previous bill. And so we don't necessarily call this a demand elasticity per se. We're just studying, how consumers responded to the price shock that's generated by the introduction of the subsidy notch. And as I mentioned, smart meters could play an important role here, both in terms of helping utilities improve collection efficiency by allowing them to, remotely disconnect customers or at least threaten to do so. But they could also provide customers with more real-time information about their consumption, and that would help customers sort of better respond to these price shocks. So, with smart meters, you might expect if customers are indeed, using the information that they provide, you might expect that in response to a similar price shock, we'd see a much larger, negative effect on consumption and a much smaller positive effect on arrears. Okay, I'm going to turn now to our long-run estimates. So as I mentioned, the utilities use an adjustment factor called a slab to approximately equalize the price schedule on a per day basis for customers that have billing cycles of different lengths. And the idea here is quite simple. So for a customer who's on a 28-day billing cycle, they should be paying fixed charges that are roughly 28 by 30 of the fixed charges that a customer on a 30-day billing cycle would pay. And similarly, the steps of the increasing block tariff should be shifted according to the slab as well. Now, instead of weighting each day in the billing cycle equally, the exact formula that the utilities use to do this introduces an error. So they're taking the number of bill days in a calendar month, dividing it by the number of days in the calendar month, and summing over the calendar months that contain that billing period. This creates some per bill day variation in prices, such that customers that are on very similar billing cycles, but that are just offset by 1 or 2 days, are effectively always facing a slightly different price schedule. So for example, we can take 2 customers who are both on a 28-day billing cycle, except one customer has 16 days of that billing cycle fall in the month of February and 12 days fall in the month of March, whereas the other customer has 17 days of their billing cycle fall in the month of February and 11 days fall in the month of March. Well, in that case, the slab adjustment for those 2 customers would be different, right? For the first customer, it would be 16 divided by 28 for the number of days in February, plus 12 divided by 31 for the number of days in March. Whereas for the second customer, it would be 17 divided by 28 plus 11 divided by 31. And that would yield a slightly different slab adjustment. So what we're doing here is we're using the slab adjustment as an instrument for the long run average price. And just to illustrate how this instrument is generating variation in the average price, we've created these sort of hypothetical figures which help us sort of illustrate this point. So we take 6 sample billing cycles shown at the bottom here. These are all the same length. They start in February, end in March, but they're just offset by 4 days. And we run these through the price schedule for early 2018. So each line here corresponds to the average price that's calculated using the slab adjustment corresponding to these 6 different billing cycles. Now, as you can see, below the lower steps of the price schedule, fixed charges are going to dominate for customers that have more of their billing cycle fall in the shorter month, which is February here. And that trend reverses as you go up the price schedule. At this really big step at 400 kilowatt hours, we see that the exact location of the notch varies slightly depending on the slab adjustment. And so the slab adjustment is generating variation in the average price, both by increasing the marginal likelihood that a customer goes over one of these subsidy notches, but it's also generating just this type of variation where at any given level of consumption, your average price could be slightly higher. Now, month to month, the slab is generating variation in the range of about 2 to 3% of the average price for a given level of consumption. It's a very complex adjustment, not very salient to consumers. We don't expect this strategy to work on a monthly basis, given that we don't expect customers to notice that their bill is 2 to 3% different from their neighbor's bill because their slab is higher. But the variation persists over the course of a year. Customers are exposed to small variation in the long run average price of electricity, and the real benefit of this instrument is that it's operating at every point in the price schedule. It affects both fixed and volumetric charges. The challenge here is going to come in terms of standardizing the years. So we have a lot of growth in new connections in the data, right? We don't want to compare customers that have lower consumption just because they receive their connection in September following the peak season. And so we try to do everything on a per bill day basis to try to adjust for that. So we use the slab per bill day in the year as an instrument for the long run average price. Again, the variation is not coming from the number of days in the billing cycle. That's something that we're controlling for. It's coming from the precise dates of the billing cycle. The first stage effect of the slab per bill day on the average price is going to be nonlinear over the price schedule, as I showed you in the previous figure. And so we'll estimate elasticities separately by deciles of average consumption in 2018 for domestic and informal sediment customers, and by quintiles of average consumption for commercial and industrial customers. So just mathematically, what's going on here? In the first stage, we are regressing the log of average price paid by customer I in year Y on the slab adjustment, on the slab per bill day. And in the second stage, we're regressing the log of consumption, of annual consumption per bill day on the predicted price. Now we have a bunch of controls for the number of days in the billing cycle, number of billing cycles in the year. We have customers that don't have a full year of billing, so we control for the number of bill days in a quarter. We control for customer and fiscal year fixed effects and cluster standard errors at the customer level. To look at non-payment responses, we use arrears on the left-hand side and control for consumption. And just to show you that our instrument is exogenous, we look at the unconditional correlations between the slab per bill day and the household characteristics for the sample of customers whom we surveyed. So everything here is from the survey except for informal settlement, which is a billing concept. And what we find is that that none of these household characteristics appear to be correlated with our instrument, which supports the identification strategy. We also look at correlations with annual household income, which is by far the most important predictor of electricity consumption, and we don't see any significant correlation there as well. So turning to our main results for our long-run analysis, we've reported here our first stage estimates, which are the two figures on the top, and we do this separately for domestic and for informal settlement customers. So as I mentioned earlier, the first stage effect is highly nonlinear over the price schedule. The magnitudes here are a little bit tricky to interpret because we use a log linear model, but essentially the effects of a 1 standard deviation increase in a slab per bill day vary from a 3% reduction in the average price in the first decile for domestic customers to about a 4.6% reduction in the 9th decile for domestic customers. And similarly for informal settlements, it varies from about a 2.2% reduction in the first decile to about a 3.5% reduction in the 7th decile. The figures below are our estimates of demand elasticities. And before I get into the magnitudes, we see a consistent U-shaped pattern in these elasticities. And the reason for that is in the lower deciles of consumption, we see that customers have very few appliances. So we see in our data that they have no more than a few lights, fans, phone chargers. And so there's less a margin for adjustment in response to a change in prices. Elasticities are largest in the middle deciles of the consumption distribution. And then in the upper deciles, income starts to dominate in terms of reducing price sensitivity. And so that's really what explains the U-shaped pattern. Our estimates of demand elasticities for informal settlement customers are smaller than for domestic customers. And I'll explain why that may be the case on the next slide. So here we're looking at the effects of an increase in the average price on annual average arrears. So the figures on the top are the same as before. They illustrate our first stage effects, whereas the figures on the bottom are our estimates of the arrears elasticity with respect to the average price. And so as you can see, for we see that an increase in the average price has a positive effect on arrears, and that's operating throughout the distribution of consumption. Now, the way we reconcile the larger arrears elasticity estimates for informal settlements relative to domestic with the smaller demand elasticity estimates for this group of customers relative to domestic is precisely through this channel of non-payment. Non-payment is concentrated in these informal settlement communities, and the more non-payment there is, the more it's going to dampen the effect of or the demand elasticity, because now the effective price increase is smaller in magnitude. Okay, so coming to some observations, we find that residential customers in Delhi appear to be very price sensitive. Our estimates are about 3 to 5 times larger than the best estimates from the US. This is not surprising given that there's more dynamism in appliance investments in our setting. These informal settlement customers appear to be much less elastic in terms of their demand compared to residential customers, but then their non-payment responses are 3 to 4 times greater. And so again, non-payment could play a role in dampening the magnitude of the demand elasticities. I didn't show the results for commercial and industrial customers graphically, but we find that their demand is even more elastic than these other customer types. And yet they pay rates that are well above the average cost of supply for utilities, and they also cross-subsidize residential and informal settlement customers. Okay, I mentioned the U-shaped pattern in the demand elasticities. So in the bottom deciles of consumption, people are on lifeline levels. they have fewer appliances, and so that leaves lesser margin for adjustment in response to a change in prices. And in the top deciles, income may have a effect in sort of reducing price sensitivity. The way we reconcile our much larger long-run demand elasticities with the smaller short-run responses that I showed you earlier are through three separate channels. So first, in the long run, customers can obviously change their appliance stocks. That would lead to a persistent change in the level of their electricity consumption. We don't expect customers to be learning about the pricing mechanism over time, but they are gaining more experience with billing, and so they can, figure out how much their billed amount might change in response to a change in their consumption. And finally, it's just harder to maintain arrears over longer time spans. So utilities will exert more effort into enforcing payments among customers that have, held arrears for much longer periods of time. And so that would reduce the sort of dampening effect that non-payment has on the demand elasticity. Okay, so I'm going to now turn to a very brief stylized model to sort of guide intuition as to how regulators should design retail prices in a setting with non-payment. So I won't get into sort of the details of this model, but I'll just kind of explain the intuition here. So let's assume that customers maintain a payment rate RP, which is a function of the retail price, where I indexes the customer type. The regulator sets prices to maximize its objective function, which is the sum of producer and consumer surplus, subject to the utilities break-even constraint. You'll notice that the payment rate appears in the utilities break-even constraint because utilities, utilities lose revenue when people don't pay their bills, but it doesn't really appear in the regulator's objective function. And the reason is, we think the regulator we assume that the regulator considers non-payment to just be a transfer to consumers. Now, you might think that, regulators, policymakers do care about non-payment because it, perpetuates informality, it worsens service quality, in which case some of those concerns would be incorporated into the regulator's welfare rates, which is WI here. Now, WI essentially, if it were equal to 1, then the regulator would just set prices so that, marginal utility equals marginal cost. But to the extent that the weights vary by customer type, that just creates a wedge. So that, there might be some customer types that are paying rates, above the marginal cost, and others that are paying rates below the marginal cost. So we solve this first order condition with respect to P, which yields this equation. And so you can see the retail price here is a function both of the demand elasticity, dQdP, as well as the payment rate elasticity, dRdP. Now, if we were to assume that there was no non-payment and we're in a world where the regulator sets welfare rates equal to 1, then the equation on the previous slide would simplify to what's known as the Ramsey pricing rule, which says that price markups are inversely proportional to the demand elasticity. So markups should be higher in markets where demand is less elastic and lower in markets where demand is more elastic. What's interesting is that we see the opposite of this in our context, right? Commercial industrial customers have more elastic demand, and yet they pay prices that are higher than what other customer types pay. We also, another comparative static that falls out of this model is that retail prices are inversely correlated with the payment elasticity. And so we're not using this to say that, regulators should lower prices in markets where people are more payment elastic, but rather to say that raising prices in these markets would potentially exacerbate non-payment and reduce welfare. Okay, so I'm going to now conclude with some policy implications based on all of the analysis that I've showed you. So just descriptively, we find in this context that subsidies, despite being very generous, don't appear to reach the poorest in Delhi. They're not very well targeted. So per kilowatt hour, customers in the bottom decile of consumption pay rates that are about 2.5 times higher than that of customers in the 5th decile and 1.3 times higher than that of customers in the top decile on average. And this is really driven by these fixed charges, which disproportionately impact poorer consumers. And these fixed charges have been going up during our sample period. So, one way to sort of get around this problem is to essentially apply subsidies on fixed charges rather than on the volumetric rates, as that would help to make the price schedule less distortionary, but also more equitable. Based on economic theory, this is something that has been written about by economists like Severin Borenstein and Jim Bushnell at the University of California. But that's something that would sort of help make the price schedule a lot less aggressive in this setting. The second sort of key implication for policy here is that we find that consumption is the least elastic and non-payment is the most elastic for these poorest residential consumers compared to the other customer types. And this suggests that subsidies can be relatively effective in this setting in delivering surplus to these poorest customers compared to the amount of distortions that they create. And raising prices on these poorest customers could come at a significant cost in terms of the reduced surplus. We also know that these are the customers who are hardest to reach using other types of transfers. But we also know that raising prices could exacerbate non-payment, which would mitigate the improvements to utility finances that the price increases were intended to support. In contrast, we find that commercial and industrial customers are the most elastic, yet they pay prices that are 2 to 5 times higher than residential customers. This suggests that this is actually the largest source of distortion in this market. And we would expect that lowering prices for commercial industrial customers would improve the financial health of utilities because it would increase consumption on the intensive margin. But we would also expect it to potentially grow the commercial industrial customer base of utilities, as many of these customers in developing countries use all sorts of backups, like battery inverters, diesel gensets, even captive power plants to compensate for the overpriced and often unreliable supply of electricity from the grid. And so, going back to the subsidy equality trap that I mentioned in the beginning, a reasonable starting point for reforms here would be to sort of reduce prices for commercial industrial customers before considering taking away subsidies for residential customers, as that would, help the utilities raise more revenue, which they could then use to make investments in network upgrades to improve the reliability of supply. And then that would help to justify raising rates on residential customers later on if there continues to be a revenue shortfall. Finally, we don't really get into this much in the paper, but there are implications of this work for market-based environmental policies as well. For carbon pricing. So, if you were to take the estimates of retail price elasticities of demand that have been found in the US context, for instance, and apply those to evaluate the impact of a carbon price in India, you would potentially underestimate the or underestimate the sort of effect of the policy because you'd be sort of underestimating the behavioral response. So that's kind of another implication of this work. So I'm mostly done at this stage, but I will see if there are any questions so far. If not, I will talk a little bit about some future directions that we want to sort of take this work in. So first, we have been thinking a lot about sort of the dynamics of non-payment, right? What does sort of arrears accumulation look like? Is it sort of, is it the case that people leave sort of a small amount of their bill unpaid? Or is it that there are people who just never paid their bills? And it's basically some combination of the two. What makes it tricky for us to really, understand these dynamics is that, utilities billing systems aren't very robust. So we see customers, kind of dropping in and out of the data. We have developed some rules to identify potential disconnections. But it could also just be the case that that there are some of issues in the way that utilities maintain this data. So that's certainly a challenge, but something that we'd like to sort of get into a little bit more. And secondly, we're very interested in understanding what the value of lost load is in this context. Now, this is a very influential concept in electricity markets in general. The value of lost load is the willingness to pay to avoid 1 kilowatt hour of lost consumption. We have a companion paper from, which we used sort of the same data for, that tries to estimate how consumption changes in response to an increase in outage events. And so we're essentially also estimating an elasticity there, the elasticity of annual consumption with respect to a 1 hour increase in outages. And so combining those estimates with our price elasticities of demand allows us to estimate, to produce annual estimates of the value of lost load, which we have found is about 15 cents per kilowatt hour in this context. And the reason that this is really interesting is because these are one of the first revealed preference estimates of the value of lost load that have been developed. Because outages are so much less common in developed country contexts, most of the work that's done in terms of estimating this parameter relies on stated preference or proxy methods. Whereas, since we're in a context where outages are fairly common, we can actually figure out what the willingness to pay to avoid a unit of lost consumption is using revealed preference, using actual data. And so just to mention a couple points about that work, we found that basically a 1 hour increase in outages per month leads to a 4.5% reduction in annual consumption, which is a really large effect. Some of that, of course, is mechanical. You can't consume electricity when there's an outage, but we actually find that most of that effect is driven through appliance investments. So people who face more outages also invest in fewer appliances in the long run. And so it's really the extensive margin that's driving that effect. So that's a little bit about some future directions that we plan to sort of take this work in. I do see one question in the chat. So I'll just read it out. Thank you for the presentation. Interesting findings. Any thoughts on how the energy rebound concept plays a role in this analysis? That's a really good question. So I think we don't expect the energy rebound effect to play a huge role here, because we're not actually studying how I guess the real answer is I haven't really thought about this too much, but we haven't we're not looking at basically how prices impact the efficiency of appliance stocks, although that's certainly a very interesting direction in which to take this work. We are confident, though, that we are generating exogenous variation in prices in a way that's not going to be sort of correlated with the sort of efficiency of customers' appliance stock. So I don't think that should necessarily affect the findings, but I think it's certainly interesting that an interesting thing to look at is to see how how prices impact the sort of efficiency of the appliance stocks that people own, and how that might play a role here. But yeah, I'm not sure if the speaker wants to come off mute and elaborate, in case I didn't answer the question. Okay, well, one other question that actually, one question that, we've been asked before, is sort of related to why we're estimating elasticities with respect to average price and not marginal price. And so that's, a very important question, because clearly marginal price matters more for economically efficient retail pricing. The reason is sort of twofold. One is that, there have been some papers recently that have found that consumers optimize their consumption in response to average price and not marginal price, from sort of the US context. And those papers are basically estimating these effects and settings where tariff schedules are far less complex than the one that we're dealing with here. And so, in our setting, we have subsidies that are being applied on volumetric rates, subsidies that are being applied on fixed charges, and then subsidies that are being applied also on the total bill, which makes it very difficult to unpack the components of average price. And so that's, really the reason for using this approach. But I think it's sort of supported by the findings of the earlier literature. And really what we're interested in here is, how do we sort of bring utilities out of this situation where, they're just perpetually cash strapped and unable to, provide reliable electricity to consumers. We're not so much thinking about kind of social welfare here. We're really thinking about how do we sort of improve utility revenues? And from that perspective as well, it makes more sense to be looking at average price instead of marginal price. If those are all the questions, then I will stop now and hand it over to Rebecca.
IAEE wishes to thank Shefali Khanna for an outstanding webinar. This webinar will be available on IAEE's website for future download. If you're not already a member of IAEE, we welcome you to join by visiting www.iaee.org. We thank you for attending, and I officially close this webinar.